You ever feel like your financial advisor is not listening to you or perhaps not telling the whole truth? Well, stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And today, we're exploring why you might just feel as though your financial advisor doesn't always listen to you and sometimes doesn't tell you the entire truth. And you know what? You're also going to learn why it might not be his or her fault.
Yep. Well, Dave, it's such an important topic, and I think a lot of our listeners can maybe relate to people in their lives, not actually listening to them. But it's great to be here with you, of course, and with all of our listeners. And I know you were out of town this weekend, so you had some fun last week when you were out.
I did.
Hopefully.
I had some fun, and that was great having the whole family together at a particular place. We went away, went to the beach, and it was nice.
Nice.
It was good. You don't get to do that very often,
Yeah. It's always good to get the family together and to spend time together. But hey, that's a great example sometimes of people that you just feel sometimes you're talking to them and they're just not really listening to you all the time, right?
And I listen to you all the time. Like I heard you had a fun weekend too last week. You went to the dentist.
Oh yes,
that sounds like a lot of fun.
It's always exciting going to the dentist, but luckily a clean bill of health, so no worries there.
You have to, you're too young for root canals.
Yeah, no worries with that. But I think today's topic will be really important, especially for our listeners that are making that shift. They're about 10 years out from retirement, and they really need to understand what they're really not hearing from their advisors and why financial advisors aren't sharing with them this information.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to stress is, 10, maybe even 15 years before retirement, there's some critical shifts that people should be making when it comes to their investment strategy, shifts that are often not taught to most financial advisors. And Sarah, we have in our office a couple people whom I consider to be conspiracy theorists, right? We don't need to mention them on here.
Couple tinfoil hat people, of course.
We know who they are.
Every office has them, right?
And I'm not one of them. I don't. Hopefully, don't think I'm one of them.
Not you, Dave. Not you.
No, I feel like I tend to be balanced with things.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree.
And the regulatory authorities in most major firms tell their advisors that, hey, number one, you need to listen to your clients. Number two, you need to disclose everything. But I do feel like there's a little bit of behind the scenes wink, wink, don't ask, don't tell, because if you listen to the client all the time, then the fear is that you may not be able to sell what it is that you sell, right? And every firm has something they typically prefer to sell. Secondarily, if you disclose everything, then somebody might not want to do it. They might say, well, ooh, that's too scary, and not do it. So even though financial advisors are taught to disclose everything and to listen, I think in many cases there's this undertone of maybe stop short of everything, right? And the good news for our listeners today, Sarah, is that if you have an income specialist, if you're working with an income specialist, then that income specialist should have the confidence to disclose literally everything to you without any fear that they're going to ruin the chance of getting you as a new client.
Absolutely. And that's just one of the ways that income specialists are different from your average financial advisor. Now let's get into our first Ask Dave question. We have a question from Eric in Nevada. He says, my advisor is a CFP, that's a certified financial planner. So surely he's trained the right way. I do feel like he listens to me and that he's telling me everything, right?
Well, Eric, and hopefully he is doing both those things. I hope you're correct. But I want you to understand that when you become a CFP, you're essentially a generalist, okay? So some CFPs specialize in one thing and others specialize in something totally different. But as a CFP, you're trained, and I know because I'm a CFP, I was trained in overall financial planning. I'm trained in insurance. I'm trained in investments. I'm trained in college tuition planning, retirement planning, income tax planning, helping people save income taxes, and estate planning. Now, the question is, what is the niche of your CFP? If your CFP doubles as an income specialist, as I do, well, then you're probably correct. If that CFP doesn't, then I would be skeptical, Eric, that they're doing that they're disclosing everything and that they're fully listening to you, because the training is taught to be in a very specific way. All CFPs are taught to do things the same way. And I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying that for some people who are retired or approaching retirement, oftentimes there can be a little bit of a better way. And I'm not picking on the CFP credential because I'm a current CFP practitioner. I do my continuing ed every year, and it is the goal. It is really the holy grail of education for financial advisors. But it teaches you to be a generalist. So think about this, Eric. Let's imagine if you graduate with a liberal arts degree, right, in history or a liberal arts degree in general. That makes you a generalist. You were smart enough to get through school. You learned how to study, right? But what is it that you know well enough that you can now take to the workforce? And that's the challenge. It's not like you graduated with an engineering degree or anything like that. And the same is often true with the CFP. So it assures a baseline level of knowledge, but then you've got to dig deeper and find out what that person's specialty is. So stay tuned, Eric. We're going to be talking a lot more about this coming up right here this morning.
All right, Eric, thank you so much for sending in your question for Dave. And if any of our listeners have a question, maybe about a credential that you heard, or maybe a question about your advisor you're working with, please send in all of your Ask Dave questions to our email address. That's askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today's show is all about why your financial advisor might not be telling you everything. And Dave, you just answered a great question from Eric, who said, hey, my guy he's a CFP, he's a certified financial planner, and that must mean that he is telling me everything and he's training me the right way. And Dave, you said not really, not exactly. It doesn't always mean that just because you have the CFP. In addition to that, I think making that distinction between a generalist and an income specialist is very different from a generalist.
Yes, and first of all, let's talk about the listening part. You listen to your clients. Yep. That has nothing to do whether you're a CFP or not a CFP, or it really doesn't matter because some people are good listeners and some are not, right? Some are they have more empathy naturally. They'll listen. They'll try to deviate, and that's dangerous too. If you listen too much to your clients and they want something different from what you do, you may be tempted to stray into an area that's not your area of expertise and maybe not do a great job. So it's great to listen, but you've also got to be able to have the courage to say, look, that's not my niche. You need to go talk to somebody else.
Yep, absolutely.
So listening is more of a personal character thing than it is something that can be trained to a heavy degree. But now, this concept of, what we are taught to do when it comes to disclosing everything. And we do disclose everything, even in engagement agreements that you make with a prospective client. But there are other things I believe that aren't always disclosed, or aren't often disclosed, I should say. And again, this is where let's try it out just for a minute here. Let's test. You're not a CFP. I am a CFP, right? Right. But you've been with me long enough. You know a lot of this, right? So let's start with this. Number one, if you want to get more return on your money, you have to take more what?
More risk.
More risk. Okay, that's what we're taught in CFP school. Perfect. Question number two, which is going to give you more total return over the long run? A higher dividend, blue chip value type approach in the stock market, or a growth approach?
The growth approach.
The growth approach.
Yep.
Once again, you pass. So you now are 2 for 2 on CFP questions, and that's exactly true. But imagine for a moment, like we talk about on the show, if that weren't always true. Imagine if it's true, but it's only part of the truth. In other words, imagine if there were another way. What if there was a way you could get more return without taking more risk, right? Wouldn't that be preferred by most people?
I think most of our listeners would love to know a way that they can actually make more return without taking all that risk.
So let's talk about that coming up. Next, we'll talk about how you can get more return without necessarily taking more risk. I'm David Scranton here at Sarah Samuels, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where, yes, it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today's show is all about why your financial advisor may not be listening to you or to everything that you're saying, and why they might not really be telling you the whole truth. So Dave, so far we talked a little bit about why income specialists are different from just certified financial planners, which are really generalists, and that most advisors are taught that you get more return when you take more risk, and that the growth approach is really the better approach over the long term.
Yeah, and once again, I want to stress, Sarah, that when we talk about advisors not telling you the whole truth, it's not their fault. I think it's part of what they were trained on, whether it's by their firms or through other organizations. And like I said, the CFP is truly the holy grail when it comes to educating financial advisors, right? But like you said, you passed my quiz right before the commercial break, right? I said, if you want to get more return, you have to take more what?
More risk.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what's going to do better over the long run? And a growth strategy or some high dividend blue chip value strategy?
A growth approach, yeah.
Growth approach. That's one way to do it. But that's not the only way. You see, what I found when I looked at the math, and I think, we talked about during the pandemic, there was a lot of political language out there about, trust the science, trust the science. Well, when it comes to investments, I say trust the math. Trust the math. And it's really simple, Sarah, because if forget about income taxes, capital gains and everything for a moment, but if the market were to go straight up, dividends and capital appreciation, dividends and growth have the same power. You'll get the same amount of money from a certain rate of return, regardless of whether it comes from dividends or capital appreciation. But we know the market doesn't go straight up. We know there are dips. And when there are dips, dividends have more power, right? So think of it this way. Think back to the year 2000. If you were in growth stocks in the year 2000, it would have taken you how many years underwater before you got all your money back?
Wow, 20 years, Dave?
13 years,
13
right?
years, yeah.
2000 to 2012. It would have taken you to get your money
13.
back if you were in growth stocks. But what if you got a 4% dividend and you reinvested it? Now, over 13 years, you would have bought 52% more shares, right? Because those dividends got reinvested. So now the growth investor 13 years later was barely back to break even. The dividend investor was up 52%. You follow me?
Yep. He was able to take advantage of when the market basically lost all that potential because the dividends kept going.
There's something that good that came out of the portfolio, whereas with a growth portfolio, nothing good came out of it when you're underwater for 13 years. But it gets better than that. Why? Because those years when the market was underwater, 2000, 2003, 2004, after the tech bubble burst, 2008 and 9 with the financial crisis, those dividends bought even more shares. So now instead of at the end of 13 years being up 52%, you might have been up 70 or 80%. Why? Because those dividends helped you dollar cost average. They bought more shares when the market was down. So again, that's the lesson I really think people need to understand, Sarah, is that, taking more risk to get more return is one way of doing it. Yeah. But it's not the only way.
Right.
Let the math work for you. Let the dividends and the dollar cost averaging do it without all that extra risk.
Yep, that dividend has that built-in lifeboat almost, right? That kept it afloat even when the markets weren't doing well with the growth approach. All right, let's get into our Ask Dave question. So this is a great question. We have Rob from Indiana. He says, I've been doing well with a really tech-laden portfolio. I know it won't continue forever, but I really feel like I'm so far ahead, I'm going to be able to win no matter what. What do you think?
Okay, Rob. Well, remember, nothing goes up forever. And you're right. Over the last, let's call it year and a half, the tech stocks, certainly a year and a quarter, tech stocks have certainly done really well. NVIDIA is the one we always talk about that's up, that's multiplied itself over the last 5 years. But different sectors do well at different times. You have to remember, before that, we went through a period where tech stocks didn't do so well. So you're right that you get so far ahead sometimes, you figure you've stacked up enough chips that you can't lose, but that's not necessarily true. Remember, we had back in the year 2000, the technology bubble burst, Rob, and when it burst, the tech stocks were down between 70 and 80%. And in fact, that's what I think Sarah was thinking about a minute ago when she said it took 20 years for things to get better. Well, if you're in the S&P 500, bigger companies, it took 13 years to recover. I want to say it took 18 years to recover if you were just solely in technology stocks. So, Rob, imagine that. Imagine what it would do to your financial goals if you were down as much as 80% at the bottom, and it took literally 17 or 18 years to recover. Imagine what that would do to your retirement goals. Imagine if you're retired, what that would do to your actual retirement, right? So be careful. If you're riding the wave now, I think that's fine. Depending upon where you are in your life. Now, if you're within 10 years of retirement, maybe it's not fine. Maybe you want to start lowering your risk in that regard now, Rob, and say, okay, I don't want to push my luck at this point. If you're younger, then maybe you can push your luck a bit further, but maybe you put in some stop losses, some stop losses behind, so that if those tech stocks pull back, then you can sell out and not have to worry about taking the big hit. So, of course, it all has to do with how close to retirement you truly are, but I can just encourage you to be careful because nothing goes up forever.
Yep. And Rob, thank you so much for sending in your question for Dave to answer. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers have a question maybe about retirement or something you've heard, something you want to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com, and you may hear your question answered on a future show. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you feel like maybe your financial advisor isn't always listening to you, maybe he's listening, but he doesn't seem to be really hearing you, it might have something to do with the way that he was trained. So, Dave, we've talked a lot about how income specialists are different from generalists. You've also talked a little bit about how we can get more return for less risk, which really goes against the traditional thought process that you have to take more risk if you want to make more return.
Yeah, in what we just described is one way. So to make a simple analogy here, because I know if you're listening, you're thinking, gosh, this is so much against everything I've heard. I need to take more risk to get more return. You're saying I can get into bigger, higher dividend type stocks that are more value-based, not growth or momentum-based, take less risk and maybe get the same return. It happens. It does happen. It can happen. It's letting the math do the work for you. So let's assume, Sarah, that you and I were to have a little friendly competition.
Okay.
Right? And we said we're going to go out here on the street in front of our office, and
All right.
we're gonna ride a bicycle next to each other, and we're going to see who can pedal for 20 miles an hour the longest.
Okay.
And
See who loses first.
That's right. Now I get nervous because I'm almost twice your age, right? You're pretty athletic. You're in great shape. So I might think, okay, I've got to do something that's a little crafty here, right?
Okay.
So option one, you and I get there next to each other. We pedal, and chances are I'll poop out before you because I'm an old guy and you're not, right?
Yep. And we're right next to each other. So
Right. That's like taking more risk to try to get more return. Right? But let's say I get a little crafty instead, and I slip in behind you. And
Okay.
even though I'm bigger than you, I make myself small and I draft off you, right?
Yeah. Maybe you're wearing one of those little biking outfits too, Dave. So you're very aerodynamic,
Sure, I'll take your word for that. And I'll tuck in behind you.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, now I'm using 20 to 30% less energy to go to the same speed. I'm drafting off you, right? And that's much like investing and letting the math do the work for you to try to get more return. And then all of a sudden, when I see you starting to lose momentum and get really tired, I pull to the right and I pass right by you.
You take off. Yep.
So again, we can sit there and try to muscle it out next to each other and pedal our butts off and see who wins.
Yeah.
That's like taking more risk. Or I could draft off you, use 20, 30% less energy, and wait till you get tired and then go ahead.
Yep.
So again, that's much more like letting the math work for you with a higher dividend stock approach.
And I bet if we were able to poll our listeners right now and ask them what they cared about more, if they wanted to do the bike ride right next to the other person, or if they were okay with, pulling it behind and drafting, they would be okay with that approach because it's going to outlast. It's really going to be better for them over the long term.
That's right. But we're not taught that. In fact, we were taught, all the time, we were always taught studying whether it's CFP or CFA, I always learned that over the long run, dividends, are responsible for close to 40% of the return of the stock market. But anybody who's listening knows that the overall stock market pays maybe a 1 or 1.5% dividend. So if the math doesn't add up, if the average total return on the market's 10%, let's say, then 40% of that should be a 4% dividend. But the actual dividend's about a third. So unfortunately, what all academia has done is fallen short of telling you why. They tell you that dividends are 40% of the return of the market over the long run, but they don't tell you why.
Yeah. Well, luckily, you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, and we're going to tell you why. You're going to get to attend the David Scranton Academy, and he's going to explain to you how it can work out better in the long run. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And today we've been talking about how a lot of financial advisors, they might not be telling you the whole truth. They might not really be listening to you either. And it's really not their fault because, as Dave explained, most advisors are really taught a certain way and they're trained a certain way. And most advisors are really generalist, especially when it comes to certified financial planners as well. They really take a general approach. Whereas when you work with an income specialist, it's a little bit different. But Dave, I want to switch gears a little bit because you've mentioned that, most of the schools where financial advisors would become licensed and get credentialed, those schools would never recommend someone sell all their stocks and buy bonds, let's say 10 to 15 years out from retirement, right? They would never do that.
It would be blasphemy to even suggest that. That's
right.
correct.
That would be wild, right? They would never say that. Never, right? But you've mentioned sometimes, and this is where we're going to be attending the David Scranton Academy, right? You've mentioned sometimes that could actually get a better result for the clients.
That's right. And it very well can. And and we don't recommend that to people. But we will make that shift from a total return focus, regardless of where it's coming from, to more of an income first, growth second approach. So to be a little broader, whether you say higher dividend stocks or bonds and bond-like instruments, the message is to change to income sooner. And I use bonds as an example because when I'm meeting with a financial advisor, I like to blow their mind by saying, hey, should you switch the client 100% to bonds 10 or 15 years before
and they
retirement?
laugh at you and
they think
no.
I'm nuts,
Yeah.
right? And then all of a sudden, when I show them the math and explain it to them, they understand why, and it kind of blows their mind.
Yeah.
And the reason, the underlying tenets to this, Sarah, is that it's real simple. Again, you have to listen to the client, right? Think about it. Most people come in who have a bunch of money and they're approaching retirement. What's their primary concern with their money? Is it they're never ever going to touch it, they're just going to leave a giant legacy to their heirs? Is it they're going to cash it all out in a lump sum, buy something really expensive? Or most often, is most of the money there to generate income to replace their paycheck?
Most of the money, they want it to generate income to replace that paycheck in retirement.
So number one, listen to your client. Yep. It's about generating income at that stage of life or soon thereafter. Number two, if I were to say to somebody, any of our listeners here, if I were to say to you, hey, do you want me to build you a plan on what we know is likely to be true, or do we want to build a plan on what we hope is true? What's the answer going to be?
I think you're going to want to build a plan on what is likely to be true versus just hoping.
That's right.
Yeah.
You don't want to build a plan on hope. Yet most advisors are taught, as you'll see in a moment, that they're taught to build a plan on what they hope is true, not what they know is likely to be true. And they're really taught not to listen to the client. And that's a problem. And again, the good news is being an income specialist, you can listen to the client, you can disclose everything, and really put your head down on the pillow every night and feel good about yourself.
Yep. Well, our next Ask Dave question is a perfect example for this, Dave. So you can really explain these different outcomes that financial advisors versus an income specialist when you work with that person. So we have Dan from Colorado who says, Dave, we have about $1 million. I want to retire in about 10 years from now. My advisor says that over 10 years, I will end up having about $2 million, and then I would be able to generate $80,000 a year in income from that when I'm ready to retire. Is that math right?
Okay, who's this again? I missed the name.
This is Dan in Colorado.
Dan.
Yes.
All right, Dano. Well, that math is typical math that's taught to a financial advisor. And there are a couple problems with that. First of all, you want, if you're that person I just described, you want to build a plan on what you know is likely to be true, not what you hope is true. But your advisor assumed a 7% return rate over the next 10 years. And here's the reality. If your advisor built this plan for you in the year 2000 and you had a goal to retire in 2010, would you have made 7% over that period? Of course not. In fact, you would have been down 10 years later. Your $1 million might have been down to $800,000. So now, Dan, you got to have to think, okay, if you're sitting there 10 years into retirement, you're still down 20, or 10 years into your goal, you're still down 20% on your money. Are you going to want to sell everything at a 20% loss and buy bonds to generate income or start taking withdrawals? Probably not. So the reality of it is they were showing you an optimistic scenario where the market is going to be up 10 years down the road by 7% or more. That's the first problem. The second problem, Dan, is I would contend that advisor didn't listen to you. Because again, if you're like most, you said, I want to know how much income I can get from that money in 10 years. You didn't ask him what the lump sum was worth. You didn't ask him, to maximize a legacy. How much income can it generate? So have you ever considered, Dan, why they took the time to project the $1 million growing to $2 million when that wasn't your question? Your question was, how much income could I get, right? Well, the answer is because that's how your advisor was taught. And frankly, Dan, that's how I was taught. But I'm here to tell you there's a better way to project your retirement income that we'll be talking about in just a minute. A way that can build a plan on what you know is likely to be true versus what you hope is true, and can give you full disclosure and can actually Be with an advisor that listens to you. And when you say you want income, they're brutally honest that they don't have a clue what the lump sum is going to be worth in 10 years, but they have a pretty good idea what the income will be.
Yeah. Well, Dan, stay tuned because we're going to explain that better projection, that better way to project and make that plan. And thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question, of course. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers have a question about your retirement plan and you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you feel like sometimes your advisor just really isn't listening to you, that last Ask Dave question probably really struck home for you because a lot of times people just really aren't listening, and especially when it comes to advisors and advisors that maybe haven't been trained in the way that income specialists have been trained to actually generate more money for you.
Yeah, and so, okay, so again, let's go back. I know you're not a CFP, but let's give you more CFP quizzes. Let's see how you do. Okay.
All right. Let's see how we do.
So this person is probably Dan was probably heavily in stocks if he was 10 years or 15 years out of retirement. So the average stock dividend right now across the whole market, not what we can yield, but the average stock dividend across the whole market now is approximately what?
1.5%.
1.5%, even a little bit lower now, but that's pretty close. That's right. Now, what is the known component of stock market profits? Is it the gain or is it the dividend?
It's the dividend because that's the money in your pocket, not the growth.
So 1.5%, a $1 million portfolio generates how much dividend?
About $15,000.
$15,000, right. And that's assuming that they're paying no fees to their advisor.
Right.
If they're paying a 1% fee to their advisor, then their advisor takes 10 of that $15,000, and poor Dan would only get 5 of the $15,000. Essentially get half of what the advisor gets. But let's say he's doing it himself or has another arrangement, and as a result, he's getting $15,000 a year, right? So far, you passed the test, right? But now you have to think about if that $15,000 were reinvested for 10 years. And how much will that dividend be worth? And it's a tougher question. How much would that dividend really be able to be 10 years from now if it were just reinvested in that general stock portfolio?
About 18,000 or so.
About 18,000. So you've seen you've seen me do this enough. I love it.
I'm doing the math right here, Dave.
Good. Yeah. That's
sounds about right.
That's right. See, marketing people say they don't know math, right?
Hey.
Look at you. But it would be about 18,000. So that means if Dan were sitting here 10 years into the plan, as he would have been had the plan been created in the year 2000, and he was still down 20% on his money and didn't want to sell at that big of a loss, what Dan would have gotten on a plan where he knows it's likely to be true is 18,000 of dividends. 18,000.
It sounds pretty low.
It sounds low.
Yeah.
And that's why the advisors are taught not to listen to the client and build a plan on what they know is likely to be true. Instead, build a plan on what you hope is true, even though it's not what the client wants.
And that hope is around 80,000.
80,000.
Yeah.
Right. But why are they taught that? Because they want to get clients. Right. All of Wall Street would be broke if they couldn't get clients. So imagine now, Sarah, if I came to you, and let's say you were 20 years older, right?
Okay.
And you said, okay, I want to retire in 10 or 15 years, and I've got this $1 million. So I came to you and said, Sarah, I've put your paperwork together here, and I'm ready for you to sign it. But I just want to let you know before you sign it that if the market's down when you retire, your income will be $18,000. If the market's up, it'll be $80,000. So if you work with me, you're going to have anywhere between $18,000 and $80,000 of income 10 years from now in retirement. So go ahead and why don't you sign right here? Press hard. There's 3 copies.
Yeah, I think you would have lost me as a client right at that point, Dave. Because who can live off of 18,000?
I would have scared you away.
Yeah, that's scary too. 18,000 all the way to 80,000. That's a huge disparity.
That's right, big disparity. And as a result, Wall Street wouldn't get clients if they were that brutally honest. But in a moment, we're going to learn about a better way that could narrow that disparity and could get you with what you want with a little bit more certainty.
Yeah. All right. So a way to get more return with hopefully a little bit less risk and more certainty. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with Sarah Samuels. And today, we're talking about why you might just feel that your financial advisor doesn't listen to you, and perhaps sometimes why your financial advisor might not tell you the entire truth. And remember, if you're just joining us, it's not necessarily his or her fault. It's got to do with how he or she was taught in the financial industry. I was taught the very same way. And so far, we talked about how to get more return, we're taught you need to take more risk. But that's not the only way to get more return. Sometimes you can let the math do the work for you by being in higher dividend stock strategies. But then we also talked about the unthinkable, Sarah, right?
Right.
The unthinkable, that if you took your portfolio out of stocks 10 or 15 years before retirement, you put it all in bonds, how you might be in a better situation. So you sure, Sarah? Right before the break, I said, look, if doing the financial plan the right way says that, the way we're taught says that your $1 million will grow to be worth $2 million 10 years from now, and then we'll generate $80,000 of income. And that's a more glass half full scenario. Mm-hmm. But if we're underwater in the market 10 years from now, then all you can count on is your dividend.
Right. And I'm getting about a 1.5% dividend across the S&P.
That's right.
Yep.
Which means at that point you have a dividend of about $18,000 a year. So if the advisor were brutally honest, that advisor would be saying your income is going to be somewhere between $18,000 and $80,000 a year. 10 years from now. Well, how many clients is that advisor going to be able to garner if they were that brutally honest?
Yeah, well, we would have no Wall Street if financial advisors were that brutally honest because no one make a sale.
And it's not just that. You remember my ex-business partner, Steve, right? Good old Steve.
Oh,
Steve had the hemorrhoid surgery years and years ago, well over a decade, and I kind of knew how much discomfort he was going to be in. But the doctor downplayed the discomfort, right? He said, you're going to have a little discomfort after the procedure. So a couple days after the procedure, he's sitting in a bathtub full of ice cubes and water. He calls me up on the phone, and he's yelling into the telephone with some four-letter words, let's say.
Words you can't say on the radio.
Things that he wants to do maybe to the physical, not to the physical well-being of his doctor, let's say, right?
Gotcha.
Because he's in so much pain.
Yeah.
Well, if the doctor told him that Steve would have felt like he had flames shooting out of his butt after the surgery, Steve might not have done it.
Yeah.
It's for the betterment of Steve, right?
Yes.
So try this on for size. Imagine instead, we'll continue our quiz. You're 5 for 5 so far on our financial planners quiz. So imagine instead that your $1 million can get you 5% income today in bonds and bond-like instruments, which it can.
Yeah. And that's typically what an income specialist can get on for you on that amount, right?
That's right.
Yep.
So that's how much income?
It would be about
$1 million.
After 10 years, about $80,000.
Okay, so it's $50,000 today.
$50,000 starting.
And after 10 years, it'd be $80,000.
$80,000.
Right. But because that's the income, that's the more known part of the portfolio, is it not?
Right. So we can base it off of that. It's something we know.
Right. So if I said option A, you can come work with me and get anywhere between $18,000 and $80,000 of income.
Yeah.
Option B, you get somewhere between $78,000 and $82,000 of income. Is anyone in the right mind going to pick option A?
I don't think so. I don't think there's anyone out there that would want to have that huge disparity when they can choose the income option. And really, if you look at it, that income option, Dave, is really at the high estimate, looking at that using the growth approach.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a glass half
and it's
full.
guaranteed.
It's
more
I call
reliable.
it a win-win situation, Sarah.
Exactly. Win-win. All right, let's get into our Ask Dave question. So we have a question from John in North Carolina. He says, my advisor says when I retire, I should still have about 60% of my money or so in the stock market to generate more income. But I know you say that this is really not a good idea. Can you remind me again why this is not the best idea?
Well, John, again, I don't know what your advisor is recommending. Maybe they're doing higher dividend value stocks like we always talk about on the show. So maybe you're still able to get a decent income. So let's say, round numbers, John, you've got $1 million. If you do it right, you may be able to get still $40,000 of income from that 4% without touching a dime of principal by living off the interest and dividends, living off the renewable resource. But my suspicion, John, is that that's not the case. My suspicion, and this is where your fears come in, I can tell you must be a somewhat regular listener to our show here, is that you're probably thinking about this thing called the withdrawal method, right? And I suspect that with your advisor recommending what I call a cookie cutter 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, is recommending that you take systematic withdrawals in retirement. That maybe half of that 4% might come from interest and dividends, and the other half might come from principal. And the problem when you're doing that is that now you have reverse dollar cost averaging. So John, I don't know if you're with us for the whole show, but if you were, we talked earlier on about how when you have high dividend stocks and you not taking income, when you reinvest it, it helps you dollar cost average. It helps you get more return just through the dividend reinvestment, buying more shares when it's down. But when you're using the withdrawal method, John, you're being forced to sell more shares when the market's down, which means now that you're reverse dollar cost averaging. So it's bad enough that you're taking principal and you're crossing your fingers and toes and hope that it grows back. But moreover, when the market's down, if it's down for an extended period, now you're selling many more shares at a lower price to get the cash flow that you need, that 4% that I used in my example. So, John, again, I don't know specifically what your advisor is doing, what he's intending, but my suspicion is that he's intending to use the withdrawal method. And if he is, then that's where that becomes particularly dangerous. Remember, John, the only secure way you could take retirement income is to take it from interest and dividends and not touch a dime of principal. I hope that helps.
John, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave email. And if any of our listeners have a question that you want to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com, and you might hear your question answered on a future show. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today's show has been all about why you might be getting that feeling your financial advisor isn't really listening to you, especially if you're in that red zone, right? That important 5 to 10 years or so before you retire. And Dave, you've mentioned this a few times. It's not really the advisor's fault. It's really how they're trained. And of course, we talked about the disparity of outcomes, right? How many clients would an advisor be able to really get if he had to say, hey, you either get $18,000, but hopefully you get up to $80,000, as opposed to when you work with an income specialist that can reliably say, hey, based off what we know to be true, you can end up getting about $80,000 a year in income.
Yeah, and that calculation we made, so you were, let's see, you're 7 for 7 now on your financial planner question.
I'm almost
which is
there.
Pretty impressive, right?
Almost have it.
And here's the thing, we did that math without ever calculating the lump sum.
Yeah.
See, I'll tell people.
No lump sum at all, right?
I'll tell people in a brutally honest method, I'll say, look, I can't tell you what your money's going to be worth in 10 years from now, and anybody who thinks they can is lying.
Right.
I
It's
can't
a guess.
tell you.
They're guessing.
And since you want to build a plan on what you know is likely to be true versus hope is true, I am going to do you a favor, and I'm not going to guess Mr. and Mrs. prospective client. But because you told me your major goal here is income, we're going to do the calculation based upon income and grow that. And that I can tell you within a pretty good range. Now, if there's a devastating economy, right, Sarah, where companies are going bankrupt left and right, and they're cutting dividends and companies are defaulting on preferreds and bonds, then okay, then even the income approach isn't as solid as we talked about. Yeah. But then again, the growth approach becomes that much worse than I even projected, right? You're not even getting $18,000 a year. Yeah. But the point is to listen to the clients. Listen to the clients, and when they say they want a plan on what they know is likely to be true versus what they hope is true, give them what they want. When they say they want income from this money, then don't calculate a lump sum, calculate income. And you don't have to, as you know, Sarah, we talk about, again, to get advisors' attention sometimes when I'm talking to advisors, I talk about selling all your stocks and buying bonds 10 or 15 years out of retirement. You don't have to do that. Yeah. When I say bonds, I mean bonds and preferreds and some BDCs, right, bond-like instruments. And also you can include some high dividend common stocks. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, like kind of going back to John's question, where his advisor, you determined is probably going to be using a withdrawal strategy. But what if someone really wants to stay in the stock market in retirement? There's a way to do that the right way with income.
Yeah, the high dividend strategies. Yeah. Even if you have an advisor, and that's something where you probably wouldn't want to do that on your own, because it's actually more dangerous, believe it or not, in some ways, because higher dividend companies are companies that are at the mature stage of their life cycle, right? And the question is, are you at the beginning part of the mature stage or the end part of the mature stage where you're going to go into decline and maybe cut dividends? That's a risk.
Right.
So you probably want to work with a professional. But, for us, if we have clients that are 100% in the stock market right now, they're still getting a 3.5% dividend after all of our fees, right? So it may not be as much as bonds or preferreds, but 3.5% is better than a sharp stick in the eye. It's not bad, especially if you have some upside potential.
Yeah, especially when you said after fees too, is that's one of the important things that you always say to watch out for when you're working with an advisor, looking at what they're actually charging you in the fees.
Yeah, and you really can't do this through mutual funds and ETFs. I know we just had a show on mutual funds and ETFs. You really can't do it with that. You have to have individual securities, which is why I tell people most of the time, don't try this at home.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's always great to work with an income specialist. And if you want to check out that episode that Dave just mentioned where we talked about mutual funds and ETFs, or you want to listen to this episode again, all you have to do is go to our website, retirementincomesourceradio.com.
And most important, we hope that you join us right here next week, same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.